It's with great pleasure today that I welcome Professor Jane Smith to Middlebury in our ongoing lecture series in Scott Symposium on Immigrant Religions in America. And I'm going to give a very brief introduction, and then we'll move right on to her talk. Before I start, though, I want to just briefly draw your attention to an upcoming symposium conference this weekend on Muslims in the state in the post 9/11 West that will be taking place here this tomorrow and Saturday, and I hope that you can attend that as well. When we first started thinking about a year ago, and we were talking in the religion department about bringing somebody to talk about Islam and immigrant religion, I really couldn't think of anyone besides Jane Smith that I would want to have come. And in part that was because of having used her work in my courses in the past and at the moment. And in part it's because it's become, although it's not an area that I'm personally familiar with, increasingly challenging to provide a cogent overview of the Muslim experience in the United States. And Jane Smith has published voluminously on the subject, and most recently a book on Muslim, co-authored a book on Muslim women in America, and it's her Islam in America, which gives a general overview of the subject that I continue to use in my own courses. And with her ongoing involvement at the Duncan Black McDonald Center at Hartford Seminary, she in many ways is institutionally positioned as well at the forefront of understanding what exactly it is, or what American Islam will look like in the coming century and now millennium. And that, as well as many lectures and her involvement as an editor in the Muslim World, puts her in a specific place where she can really speak to the development of an American Islam, if I can already hedge my bets by framing it in those terms. So without further ado, I would like to welcome her today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Can everybody hear me? All right, if I wander away from the mic, which I'm told I must not do, just wave your hands and I'll try to come back again. This is a pleasure, and what a gorgeous day. Thank you very much for coming up with this delightful weather for me. I was chatting with a friend last night, and she said, "So what are you talking about tomorrow?" And I said, "Well, we're talking about whether or not Islam is a truly American religion." And she just gave me a look which said, "Oh, please, you can't possibly be making that argument." Well, I'm not sure I will make an argument one way or another, but what I'd like to do is just set out some of the issues that I think are necessary to think about if we're going to be considering Islam, as you have been thinking about other major world traditions in the American context, and see what it means to think about it as an American religion. So I start out by simply giving a few orienting facts and figures. I know some of you know some of this basic material quite well, others of you may not, so we'll go rather rapidly to try to give you a general picture. So I started out with, I don't know, can you see this behind me? Am I in the way? Anyway, you can look around. Start out with a question of who's here? Now, my mandate is to talk about immigrant Islam, and I will try to do that. On the other hand, it's very hard to do that because we have immigrant Muslims and African American Muslims, and in a minute I'll try to debunk those categories too. But it is fair to say that at this particular time, at this moment in history, and in this geographical location of the U.S., we are experiencing the most heterogeneous Muslim community ever. Now that's a very exciting possibility. maybe a little frightening for some, but it's very exciting. And it also presents very particular challenges for the Muslims who are here, and whether they like it or not, they're here together. So part of what they need to do is to think about their togetherness. As I said, there are over 100 countries represented, perhaps more than that. How many Muslims are there? And here we'll talk about all of them in the U.S. I don't even want to hesitate to offer a guess on that, but I get asked so often that I'll put up 6 million and tell you I think it's probably a little less than that, but that's kind of a ballpark. Well, the first Muslims who came to the U.S., and this happened in the late 1900s, were a very small group. Actually, Muslims from the Middle East were a tiny minority of a larger Christian community coming from the Middle East. But those who came at that time, in the very early part of the 20th century, didn't find any other Muslims here. But then, of course, they weren't thinking very much about the fact that they were Muslim at that point, the way they are a century later. But Muslims who arrived after the First World War, in another wave, after the Second World War, I put here surprise, they found, if they were looking, that there were some Muslims here, and not just those who had come in, emigrated from the Middle East, but they found the beginnings of a Muslim community, if one can define it that way, in the African American population. So suddenly you've got two overall communities. The African Americans, were they Muslim or not? That's a question that doesn't come into our conversation today. And immigrants starting to come from different parts. And since that time, immigrant Muslims and African American Muslims have had sometimes a parallel history, sometimes a rather stormy history, and sometimes a history of cooperation. And I say that only because to understand the experience of immigrant Muslims, you really have to see that the larger picture is one in which we talk about African American Muslims, and now increasingly converts from the Anglo community, and particularly from the Hispanic community. So all of those things come to play on thinking of Muslims who are from, or whose families have been from, parts of the Muslim world as they consider whether or not there is such a thing as an American Islam. So now, I've said a little bit about who the community is. What's the best way to talk about American Muslims? What I've been doing, and I will continue to do probably throughout this lecture because it's the easiest thing to do, is to say you can talk about African American Muslims on the one hand, and you can talk about immigrant Muslims on the other hand. How many African American Muslims? Somewhere between 30, maybe 35%. So it's a big community. That's the easiest way. And it's hard not to make that kind of distinction, but it really doesn't work anymore. It's an ineffective distinction. And if I were to be able to do it more quickly in a fairly brief lecture, I would say it's this second way of categorizing that really makes more sense. By the way, sojourners, by that I mean people who are here as students, as temporary workers, as people in the government, and know that they're here for a short period of time and go home. And they make up and are often a significant voice in the American Muslim community. So if we were to go by this second way of categorizing, we would say it's really best to think about first-generation immigrants, that is, those who were born in another country and have come over here to live on the one hand, and American-born on the other hand. Because those whom we call immigrants or part of the immigrant community may be second, third, fourth generation Muslim in this country. They don't want to be called immigrants. If they are immigrants, all of us are immigrants, unless any of you here are Native American. So they want to be known as American-born Americans. So that is the easiest and most, I think, cogent way of categorizing these communities. But it's hard to say, and it doesn't quite work either. That's a problem. Because those who are from a heritage of Islam in a different country, Pakistani, Nigerian, whatever it might be, find it often very difficult to dissociate themselves from their cultural heritage and the things that their family have brought with them to this country still come to bear in their thinking about who they are as Muslims in America, in most cases, if not all cases. So all of that is to say there isn't any good way to sort of categorize American Muslims. Having said that, I'm going to go back and try to say we'll be talking from now on about immigrant Muslims, meaning not only those who have just come, but those whose families may have come some generations back. Where are they from? They're from everywhere, but just for your interest, the largest group of Muslim immigrants in this country are from South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and they are very vocal in mosque communities, in taking over leadership positions, in becoming presidents of mosques, in helping organizing the communities. Often they are quite well-to-do. They may be physicians, engineers, people who are well-educated, well-trained, and they are assuming, in many cases, important leadership positions in the American community. Next are representatives of the Arab countries. Arab countries are, by definition, I guess, countries that speak Arabic. And many people say Muslims are synonymous with Arabs. Of course, they are not, but there are nonetheless a lot of Arabs representing a lot of different cultures in this country. And we'll say more about a couple of those a little later. Iran, large community from Iran, growing community. The largest group of those folks are located where? California, absolutely, California. There are many other places too, but there is a significant community of Iranian Muslims in California. Sub-Saharan Africa, a growing group from this tremendously large area of the world. And often African Muslims are confused in the minds of other Americans with African Americans, and that doesn't work very well for either of them. East Asia, a lot from Philippines, Indonesia, places like this, former Soviet Union, and others, just to give you a little overview. Another way to say who is here is to look at the religious affiliation. Probably 85% or so of the Muslims in America are Sunni. Well, that kind of suggests that if you call them a Sunni, you're referring to all the same sorts of folks. Well, of course, there are many ways to break down the category of Sunni. You could talk about schools of law. You could talk about ideological orientation. You could talk about a lot of different things, but it's too complicated to spell all out here. And in general, the overall umbrella of Sunni, probably more than anything else, is a way of distinguishing those Muslims from Shiites. The Shiite community, somewhere around 15% in this country, lots of different groupings within that Shiite community. Now, the distinctions between Sunnis and Shiites in this country, until recently, were there, but they were modified. There wasn't a lot of attention paid to them. Since the Iraq War, those distinctions have become more sharp and more clear, And those who are members of the Shiite community want to make sure now that there is some understanding that there are different groupings within the Shiites, the Ithna Asharis or the Twelvers, the largest community of Shiites in this country. The Ismailis or Southerners, the followers of the Aga Khan, the Zaydis, Fivers, the Alawis, the Druze. You can go on in subcategories and subcategories. And the point of this is not to necessarily learn all of these names. Some of you already know them. But to know that in post-9/11 America, belonging to specific groups, particularly for the Shiites, is a very important form of identification. So they're having to weigh, when they think about what does it mean to be an American Muslim, they have to think, I'm an Ismaili, and I am also an American, and I also have a heritage from East Africa or wherever it might be. I'll also say that the Shiites are getting increasingly vocal as participants in the conversation among Muslims. What does it mean to be Muslim in America? And particularly, they're doing some very interesting writing on the relationship of Islam, not just their own particular brand of Islam, but Islam in general, to other world religions, and specifically Christianity and Judaism. Why have they come? We'll go over this quickly because there are other things I want to focus on more. In very general terms, there has been a change from the rationale of the earliest Muslim immigrants who came, who were generally looking to make their fortune in the West. They heard about kind of good things happening in America. You want to be rich? You go to America. And some of them came because they intended to make a fortune and go home rather quickly. And that, in many cases, did not happen. That has changed and evolved. As I said before, they've come in waves after the World Wars. They particularly came after 1965, and you probably have heard that in relation to some of the other traditions coming. The immigration laws changed under Lyndon Johnson, and you have now significant numbers of Muslims coming from a variety of countries. And now, and this has continued for the last 30, 40 years, they increasingly are coming for education, and they are already well educated. Many of them coming to finish up their education over here. They're coming for financial reasons, but not because they're going to be traders or peddlers, as the first ones were, but because they're going to be entering the higher echelons of the financial world in this country. Many are well-qualified professionals, many engineers, many physicians, many others who are able to immediately assume some leadership when they come. They're here for reasons still of family reunification, and now particularly after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and with things happening in sub-Saharan Africa, and with things happening in Iraq, and things happening in Iran. Who knows what's really going to happen there? We have many people coming for reasons of political freedom. Just one little point here. I'm teaching a course at this time on Islam in America and Western Europe, which is a big bite, as you can imagine, to do in one semester. And in many ways, we're seeing some similarities in the circumstances for immigrants as they think about their identity. What does it mean to be Muslim in the West? But we're also seeing many things that are noticeably different. And one of them is this difference in financial level. Muslims on the whole earn more than on the average, earn more than the average American, and educational level. Muslims on the whole have a higher level of education. 58% of them have college degrees than the average American population. That's very different from the case in many places in Europe. And some would argue that that very difference is going to mean that we will not have the kind of political difficulties that a number of countries in Europe have been experiencing over the last 5 years or so. We'll see if that is the case. Okay, I want to look at two things now. The first question is Muslims themselves as a unit. How do they see themselves? Do they understand that as Muslims in America, they somehow are participating in a community, an ummah, that there is something distinctive about being an American Muslim that you can get your hands around, you can hold on to it and find a form of identity in that. So the question really is, how strong is that? Or how strong are those particularities that distinguish Muslims from each other? So the first thing I want to look at is, how do Muslims see each other? And then the second thing I want to look at, and that will take just a little bit more time, is how, given those things, how do Muslims see themselves in relation to the American culture of which they are a part? So, are American Muslims one ummah? There is a lot of writing being done now, and you can click online and find tons of it and find it other places, by articulate, well-educated Muslim Americans who are saying that's what we have to focus on, is the things that we have in common as Muslims, but as Muslims who are living in the West. On the other hand, there are things that are pulling them apart. Obviously, different cultures. They represent such a range of different cultures, and then those cultures come over here and mix to some degree or other with American cultures, and yet again something else emerges. And there is, of course, as within any body, the members find ways to quibble with each other. And you find Pakistani Muslims either saying or perhaps thinking, our Islam is a truer Islam than the Arabs, or you might find other groups saying, that, I'm not singling out the Pakistanis, others saying the same thing. Our way is a little better. Our sunnah is somehow more the Prophet's sunnah than yours is. Well, that's a hard conversation to have when you're trying to talk about unity. If you look at what's happened in mosque communities in this country, it's very interesting. When Muslims first came, they didn't even think about mosques. They didn't probably think very much about being religious Muslims. And then they began to say, wait a minute now, we do want to educate our children Islamically, and we have to have a context in which to do that. So groups began to form, and they began to meet here and there. And by necessity, they were culturally integrated because there weren't that many Muslims to choose from. So they had to find ways to get together. Then you began to have a few more Muslims, quite a few more Muslims, and then they were able to say, aha, we have enough so that we can have an Albanian mosque here, or we can have a Nigerian mosque here. And those worshiping communities began to be separated and defined, and that still is the case. It still is the case. And African Americans, for the most part, have their own worshiping communities. But you're beginning to see now, since 9/11, intentional movements to break down those ethnic barriers in terms of worshiping communities, and to say, if we're really going to be an American ummah, we got to find ways to come together. So we are going to merge our mosque communities. We're going to find ways to get enough money without having to incur interest, that we can build a mosque, and it's going to specifically be an intercultural mosque. Not everybody is doing that. Not even the majority are doing that. But it is a movement. And then, what, marry my daughter? Well, then you get down to the really tough stuff, where cultural heritage just weighs so much. I have a student, a convert, a white convert to Islam, young guy in his 20s, and he wants to get married. He's not quite ready to break the color barrier, at least the major color barrier, and find an African American wife, but he wants a Muslim wife. But he tries to find a Pakistani wife, and the family says, no, we want our daughter to marry a Pakistani. Same with the Palestinians and others. So the who can marry whom has something to do with religion. It has often a lot to do with culture. So these different cultures still come to play and make it difficult to think about an American ummah. Generational differences. Sometimes it's the case that the older generation are more religious and the younger generation are, who cares, you know? Being a Muslim is a sort of cultural association, but I'm not going to be a practicing one, and I'm sorry about my grandmother, but that's just the reality of it. Sometimes it's turned the other way around now. And grandmothers and mothers may say, I have no intention, for example, of showing my Muslim identity by wearing a hijab. I don't want to, I don't think it's necessary to, and I'm not going to. The granddaughters, the daughters and granddaughters, the younger ones, the ones who may be the age of some of you in college, are saying, oh yes, it is very important for us to show our unity, to show our affiliation with Islam, and particularly after 9/11. So they are starting to more and more adopt Islamic dress. And so in that case, it's the older generation less visibly practicing, and I say visibly because I'm not going to call judgment on what they do personally, and the younger ones more visibly making that kind of association. Another interesting contrast with the younger generation, now we could say lots of things, but I just want to mention that, is the Islamic music coming out of the youth. This started with African Americans, with, I don't know much about music, but rappers and that kind of thing. And it's now moved into the children of immigrant families who are coming out with some absolutely fascinating, very up-to-date music, and you would know the terminology and I don't. What I do know is it has Muslim lyrics, and it's very fun to read them, and that in many cases is quite appalling to their older generation who think that music is something that Muslims ought to stay away from, and here are the kids doing it as a way of affirming who they are Islamically. I'm going to move quickly over these last three things. Do you practice or do you not? Are you visible about your practice or are you not? A while ago, I would have said, if I were giving this talk, that over half, maybe well over half, of the Muslims in America don't consider themselves to be practicing Muslims. Now I'm not so sure. What would you say? It's a hard call. It's a very hard call to make. But I think clearly it's becoming more acceptable, more apparent that Muslims are starting more to go to the mosque, to practice in visible ways. But nonetheless, this whole spectrum from secular Muslims wanting nothing to do with the religious side of Islam to those who are very religious, and how to get those people all together in one community. Sunnis or Shiites, we talked about that before, and the rising tensions, and then challenges from the African American community. If you're going to talk about being one ummah or one community in America, you absolutely must do that, finding ways for African Americans and those who have at some point in their history been associated with immigrant Islam to come together, and the other converts. And that is a very significant challenge. There are lots of things we could say about that, and if I can say more if you want to ask about that in the question period. All right. Do Muslims in America want to be American? Well, on the one hand, we're all very aware of the fact that Muslims who practice Islam, who think about the beauties of the Islamic system, are quite appalled by many forms of American secularism, and they're trying to find ways in which to be American without buying into that secularism. At the same time, they also look at the separation of church and state that's guaranteed by our First Amendment, and it works very well for them. It's freedom from, they don't have to be under anybody's religious thumb or political thumb, and it's freedom for. They can practice their religion the way they want to because of our Constitution. So that works really well, but there are some significant issues, and I'm going to take about maybe 10 minutes to talk about those. The reality of 9/11. 9/11 was a galvanizing event for American Muslims. It was a shocking event, not just in the horror of what happened, but shocking because suddenly they were forced to think about themselves as Muslims, to think about Islam, to apologize for Islam all over. I mean, I get asked constantly, why is it that Muslims never speak out for a peaceful Islam and against a terrorist Islam? My goodness, they are speaking out constantly. Maybe the press doesn't give them the right opportunity to be heard, but since 9/11, in many ways, they have been drawn into this role, and the very fact of being drawn into it has drawn them together and has forced them to think about what does it mean to be Muslim in this American context. I put the Darul Harb and the Darul Islam categories there, not because I think we should spend a lot of time talking about them, but because those who would like to criticize Islam have latched onto those and have said, classically, Muslims have understood the land of Islam to be the land of peace and the lands beyond Islam to be the abode of war. Well, sure enough, they did. That's not the topic of today's talk. What I want to say, first of all, is that if you want to attack Islam, you can find a convenient way to do this. Muslims themselves in this country are saying those categories, if they worked at all, worked at a different time for Muslims and in a different cultural and political context. Here we are, we're Muslims in America, and we don't think this way anymore. We can justify for ourselves religiously living as Muslims in a country which is not only not majority Muslim, but in which secularism, the kind that we don't like very much, seems to be rampant. And that is a very important point. That's what Muslims are thinking. Can we live here Islamically? I'm not a Muslim, can I, as a Muslim, rhetorically, actually practice my religion if I choose to do so in this country? Well, yeah, I can. Hardly without exception. Maybe if I want to wear full niqab and I want to have my picture taken for a passport or something, there's going to be some issue, and that has come to the courts a number of times. But beyond that, pretty much so. Maybe if I want to have a mosque, which is really big and showy, and I want to have the call to prayer, and it's disturbing, whatever it might be disturbing, maybe somebody will call attention to that. But on the whole, the answer is yes, and that's a very important yes for Muslims. Shall we participate politically? Shall we be involved in the political life of this country? Many immigrants before 2000, actually, not even 9/11 in this case, 2000, said, no, we're going to be over here and we're going to be Muslim, but we're going to try and isolate ourselves as much as we possibly can from the rest of American society. Things changed, and they changed significantly with the year 2000 election. There's a lot that can be said about that. I don't have time, but Muslims are now much more active in participating in political life. You have mosques near elections where kids are coming out with signs saying, get to the polls, register, vote, be part of this movement, run for public office, elect our public officials. We Muslims can have a voice. We no longer want to be separate. We want to be part of this country. Not everybody. I'm talking about majority movements, and actively help determine the ways in which our country is going to go. There was an interesting quote by a friend of mine in California who said, around the year 2000, we got to the point where we had to choose. We either had to close in on ourselves or we had to open up and be part. And for the most part, the decision has been to open up. And we non-Muslims can just see that if we look. American foreign policy, all I need to say is clearly many, if not most, Muslims disagree strongly with American foreign policy. In Iraq, our support of Israel, we can go right down the line, a number of things. So how can I, as a Muslim, consider myself to be a loyal and patriotic American citizen when I disagree so violently? Well, many of them would say, it's my right. Guess what? That's what being an American means. I can do this. I couldn't do it in another country. I can do it in this country, and I can speak out and say, I think this is wrong or that is wrong. They, since 9/11, have a big price to pay, often, if they choose to do that. But this tension of being American but not liking all the things Americans do, well, some of the rest of us have some understanding of what that is. Identity issues, especially for youth, we've talked a little bit about this. Mosque architecture, this is a really interesting issue. Earlier on, of course, if you wanted to have a mosque, you would take over an old abandoned church or a house or something like that. Now, particularly after a few decades of help from the Saudis, that stopped now, but a lot of funding came in, and Muslims were able to say, we're going to build a mosque. Our community is going to build a mosque. Well, what kind of mosque should we build? And the decision that any individual community makes on that question has a lot to do with how they see themselves as part of American culture. You can build a mosque which really looks like the Middle East and has big minarets and all the rest of it. Or you can build a mosque which looks much more in keeping with the American architecture in the area in which it's built, and it may have something graceful like a dome or something small resembling a minaret, but it doesn't stand out. It's an American mosque. And where do you put the entrance for women? Well, I'm not necessarily going to make the case that if you have a separate entrance for women, you are not American. But what I will say is that Muslim communities, considering their architecture and how they want to have men and women relating to each other, are not unaffected by conversations in the American public having to do with women's rights and all the rest of it. They simply are. Oh, female challenges to male dominance. Again, I'll go quickly over a huge topic. Since 9/11, Muslim women have become much more visible as those who are teaching about Islam, those who are coming into public life, those who are playing a role in interfaith conversations. They have become, if not the spokespersons, much more educated about Islam, about their role in Islamic life, and about their responsibility to teach Islam as they understand it. And influenced by, but not dominated by, Western feminism. And most of them would say, if I take the title feminist at all, it's going to be an Islamic feminist, not an American feminist. Coming to close to the end here, hang in. Rethinking the nature of the family. Well, again, here's a whole topic, but so many issues related to this tremendously important unit of the family. And as Muslims look at American culture and the breakdown of the American family, and we all know the stats about that, they say, how important for us to re-emphasize the importance of this family unit. But American culture nudges at this. Shall we date? Shall our young people date? Can our boys date but not our girls? lots of ways in which this is extremely troublesome. And for some Muslim families, the tighter they rein in their teenagers, the more quickly they may lose them from at least the acceptance of Islam as a dominant way of life for them, and that gets tremendously important. Who is in charge? Traditionally, the man is in charge. Chapter 4, verse 34 of Quran, as many of you know, says men are in charge of women. A lot of Muslim women are saying, okay, maybe in some circumstances, and if the Quran says it, we have to acknowledge it, but in fact, my husband and I share things. We do things in parity. He has his responsibilities, I have mine, but basically, nobody's in charge of me. And very fascinating conversations about how to interpret a verse like that, 4:34. Toys and games, just something for you to think about. All kinds of interesting amendations on American toys, like the Islamic doll. I think her name is Rana. And you can order her in any color you would like, from white to very dark to something in between. And you can order American clothes or Islamic clothes or Islamic American clothes or whatever you would like. So kids grow up learning how to be Muslim, but to adapt in ways that can fit into our American culture. Shall women work? Big question. What do you do with your aging parents? As Muslims, we would never put our parents in an old people's home, but the realities are often with two working parents, it's necessary to do that. So the family, a whole big issue. Pluralism, another topic into itself. Do Muslims allow for, I'll put it theologically, salvation in Christianity or Judaism? I mean, suddenly, Muslims are being brought into the local Sunday afternoon interfaith conversation. The Interfaith Council of Springfield has called these people, and they call them Muslim. And the other colleagues say, well, how about it? In your Islamic understanding, are we doomed? Do we go to hell? Or do we have a chance for the same kind of ultimate salvation that you Muslims have? Well, Muslims are having to rethink this question in extremely serious ways, and some interesting things coming out, emphasizing those verses in the Quran, which in fact are pluralistic. There are some that are not, but there are many that are, and that is getting the emphasis. Foreign influences on American Islam, and then we're almost done. This big issue, the Wahhabis, the Salafis, giving money, influencing thought, providing educational literature. How influential are they? I don't know. But I do know that there is a significant influence, and particularly because in many cases, the only literature available for teaching kids and others about Islam is coming out of Saudi Arabia with a Wahhabi orientation. There is a great awareness of this on the part of American Muslims, and many of them are speaking out actively for an understanding of Islam that does not include that kind of orientation. Much more could be said about that. How do you train imams? You can't any longer have imams who were trained in Saudi Arabia or Al-Azhar and coming over here, don't speak English, don't know the American culture. We have to find ways of training our imams here, our leadership in America, for Americans, so they understand American issues at the same time that they are well trained in Islamic things. Ties with, the Shiite Ayatollahs, we'll just let that go for the moment. Ties with terrorist organizations. Our government has been very diligent in trying to smoke those out. It's made it extremely hard for many Muslims to know what to do with their zakat money, because the organizations to whom they gave that money earlier are no longer considered acceptable by our American government. But I just wanted to make the point here, as the Christian Science Monitor said last October, Radical Islam. Radical Islam finds that the U.S. is sterile ground. It isn't taking hold in the U.S. Are there any radical Muslims here? Not in this room. In the U.S., undoubtedly. But it's a whole different situation from what we find in Europe. And then finally, as Muslims in America think about who they are, how they want to identify themselves, they absolutely must consider how the American public looks at them. And obviously, the 9/11 issue is huge. Do Americans want Islam here? Well, the fact is that seems by the polls to be rising levels of Islamophobia, new term, relatively new, used a lot now. Fear of Islam, unease about this religion, and Americans are finding it very difficult. Yet the polls ease off when there haven't been any dramatic things happening, as there have not been too recently. But Americans are all over the map, some violently opposed, like some of our Christian evangelicals who have come out and said terrible things about the Prophet, about Quran, about the religion of Islam as a religion from hell. Then you have some people who are saying it's really our responsibility to help our Muslim friends and colleagues express their Islam in the most positive way. There are some who simply don't know, we've got Muslims there, what are those? I don't care, I don't want to know anything about that. And others are saying, we really need to learn something about this religion that is so tremendously important. So Muslims need to figure out who they are in a context in which they don't really know if they are wanted or not, or some do, and some don't, and some haven't a clue. So finally, is Islam a truly American religion? I gave 3 possibilities here. Non-American Muslims are ambivalent. In many cases, they seem really nice, and the principles that they espouse seem really good, but there are also some terrible things going on in the name of Islam. Can we really trust them? For Muslims, they're also ambivalent. But ambivalence becomes, in a sense, a means of survival in the American context. They don't buy in completely to being American, and yet on the other hand, yes, we are Muslim Americans, but how can we express that in a way that both shows our identity with Islam and shows our intense discomfort with some of the elements of American culture? So finally, I would say, if we have an American Islam, and we may be moving toward that, I genuinely believe that we are, it certainly must be an Islam which is defined not by the American government looking for moderate Muslims, but by Muslims themselves understanding what it means to be a Muslim American. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. Yes.
My name is Mukhtar Sadar. I'm an aerospace scientist in an aerospace company here in the region. And I agree with all, there is no comparison. I don't have any comparison to the depth of Dr. Smith and her experience, but I agree totally, almost 99.99% of her assessment.
What's the other 1%?
I can give you a few of them, but maybe it's a big debate. Yeah, but for example, I can speak with our experience here in Vermont to be more local and don't generalize a bit. We built our own first mosque in Colchester. We actually bought it. It was a company in 1999. And without any penny from the Saudis, to my knowledge.
That's over now.
That's one of the things. Right now, we we are actually, I myself and Dr. Salim Ali, who is a professor and actual associate dean of the graduate study at UVM, and other engineers at IBM and Lion, all of them are Muslims. We are in discussion with St. Michael College in Colchester to, they're gonna give us basically for free a big term lease of their chapel to use it as an elementary school to teach. It's under the independent school statute of Vermont here. And I can go, there are many other examples that's going on here where there is really work together towards a better understanding of Islam. So not all of them are monsters, I'm one of them here. So
Great, thank you. That's
what I want.
very helpful to localize it that way.
There seem to be a lot of places throughout the country where there is real conflict between Muslim and non-Muslim communities. Sort of, as you've described it, it looks as if the Muslim communities are kind of free to make up their own minds in sort of a peaceful setting. But there are a lot of places where it's really not so peaceful. There are a lot of college campuses, for instance, where there's a lot of conflict. And metropolitan areas, say, like Detroit, where there's really serious conflict.
Yeah.
Would you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. In case you didn't know, she's pointing to the fact that there are many places in this country where there are serious conflicts going on between Muslim communities and non-Muslims. There are also serious conflicts going on between Muslims and Muslims. You mentioned Detroit. That's a particular place that, if any of you have been there, large communities of Sunnis and Shiites, and they're in a lot of conflict and tension with each other. And often these conflicts have to do with the public practice of Islam. And I said Muslims can practice in this country, and they can and they do, but you're absolutely right to say there are also cases in which that practice is not allowed. They don't want mosques to be built. Mosques that are already there or other Muslim establishments, people attack them, break the windows, write nasty things on them. There is a lot of that, and it often relates directly to some terrorist act or something that's going on. So there is a lot of tension. For many Americans, there is a kind of, and don't misunderstand me on this, in-your-faceness about Islam. That is to say, many Americans would say, why do they have to be so obvious? Why do they have to build their things, do their prayers in public places, dress in this way? And it's something that it's difficult for many Americans to get used to. And they do respond sometimes in some very ugly and very hateful ways, and that's right. And when Muslims think about themselves here, that's another element that they have to take into consideration. Thank you for raising that. Yes.
Thinking back to the late 60s, many of you know why, and the country of the sojourner, the immigrant experience, but at that time people such as Malcolm X were very active in the black community, converting on a message of power and of hate. And again, you weren't focusing on that at all, but has that pretty much died out in your research, or is that still underground and viral somewhere?
There's a lot of hate. Some of it was preached in the African American Nation of Islam ideology of Rohatyn Muhammad, and Malcolm X in his earlier days certainly articulated that. Hate comes out in other ways. I mean, there's Christian hate for Muslims and Muslim hate for lots of things. But specifically, that ideology of the Nation of Islam pretty much died out, although there are extremely strong movements within the African American Muslim community that react to American racism. And it still becomes part of the rhetoric, even to the point of saying Muslims need to separate from this country and create their own country, particularly African Americans, because they are never going to get a fair deal in the American context. So, I mean, yes, in a way, it's died out as anything that could be identified as a Muslim ideology, although there's a small continuation of the Nation of Islam, probably not more than 50 to 100,000 Muslims. But you never, unfortunately, get rid of hate, and hate often tries to wear a religious dress. And I don't mean a Muslim dress, I mean to look like a religious ideology. I'm aware of the fact that we're getting close to 5:30. The sun is something we've all waited a long time for, so why don't we have maybe one more question? Yes, sir, in the back.
Yes. Has the conflict in this country between the Shiites and the Sunnis accentuated at all as a result of the Iraq War?
Absolutely. Yes, I think without any question. Identities became stronger. The Shiites have strong connections with Muslim leadership in Iran, in Iraq, and in Lebanon specifically. And as the war began to distinguish Sunnis from Shiites, and old hatreds, old territorial wars, old political contests began to be verbalized and acted out in some horrendous ways, as we know, in the Iraq context, it became transferred over here in this country, generally not with violence, but often with sort of remembering these old territorial hatreds, and they unfortunately then outshadow the movements for unity that many Muslims in this country are trying so hard to have. All right, Justin, I think it is time for everybody, if it's all right, to go out and get those last few rays of sun. Thank you very much for coming. I've enjoyed this.